December 1944. Somewhere in the snow-covered fields of Belgium, the thunder of war has finally gone silent. A column of weary German soldiers trudges through the frost, their weapons gone, their uniforms torn and mud-caked. Around them, American guards stand watch, rifles low, not hostile, just cautious. The battle for the Ardennes is ending, and the victors are now caretakers of the defeated. By dusk, the prisoners are herded into a makeshift camp, barbed wire strung between wooden posts, floodlights humming softly above the snow. The Germans expect humiliation, hunger, perhaps even revenge. Instead, a soldier in an American uniform sets down a steaming pot on the serving line. Beef stew, someone mutters. The smell of meat and potatoes drifts through the cold air. Tin trays clatter, bread, coffee, real coffee. The prisoners stare, hesitating, unsure if it's a cruel trick, but it isn't. Hours later, as night falls over the quiet camp, one captured corporal writes in his small notebook, "They feed us better than our own army ever did." That quiet act, a hot meal for the enemy, would become one of the most unexpected truths of the Second World War. And to understand why, we must go back to where it all began. By the end of 1944, the once unstoppable German war machine was bleeding from every front. The Red Army was rolling west through Poland, crushing cities that had once flown the swastika. In the west, American and British forces had broken through France, liberated Paris, and were driving toward the Rhine. Adolf Hitler, buried deep within his mountain headquarters, still spoke of final victory, but his soldiers could see the truth written in the mud, the hunger, and the silence of empty supply lines. For the average German infantryman, survival had become a miracle of chance. Rations that once contained bread, sausage, and canned meat had shrunk to a few frozen potatoes and watery soup. Horses replaced trucks. Ammunition was rationed like gold. Even elite divisions were surviving on less than half their daily caloric need. And when the winter of 1944 arrived, the coldest in years, starvation and exhaustion spread faster than the enemy advance. Then came the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's desperate gamble. In mid-December, Hitler launched his final major offensive through the Ardennes forest, hoping to split the Allied lines and seize Antwerp. For a brief moment, chaos favored the Germans. Fog-blinded Allied planes and American units were overrun. But once the weather cleared, Allied artillery and air power turned the forest into a slaughterhouse. Within weeks, the offensive collapsed. Entire German regiments found themselves surrounded, leaderless and starving. What followed was unprecedented. Thousands upon thousands of German soldiers, once sworn to fight to the death, began surrendering en masse. Some walked through the snow with hands raised high, white rags tied to rifles. Others were captured while scavenging for food. By early 1945, American field units were struggling not with combat, but with the sheer number of prisoners. The front lines became rivers of surrender, men marching west instead of east. The U.S. Army, unprepared for such magnitude, quickly improvised. Temporary enclosures sprang up across France and Belgium, fields ringed with barbed wire, known as Rheinwiesenlager, or Rhine meadow camps. At their peak, over 1 million German soldiers were held there, sleeping under the open sky, sustained by emergency rations and Red Cross aid. But the Americans faced a logistical dilemma. According to the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were to be treated humanely, fed adequately, and protected from violence or public humiliation. The law demanded dignity, even for the enemy. To uphold that, the U.S. began transferring tens of thousands of POWs across the Atlantic to the relative safety of the American mainland. It was a massive operation, convoys of Liberty ships leaving European ports, filled not with ammunition or supplies, but with captured soldiers of the Reich. For the Americans, this was both practical and symbolic. The homeland offered vast land, spare labor, and abundant food, everything war-torn Europe lacked. It also allowed the U.S. to demonstrate, to the world and to history, the moral contrast between democratic principles and totalitarian cruelty. A nation at war could still show restraint. By January 1945, the first waves of German POWs were stepping onto American soil, tired, disoriented, and bracing for the worst. Most had been told by Nazi propaganda that capture by Americans meant torture, starvation or death. Instead, they found clean camps, organized kitchens, and guards who followed rules to the letter. That contrast, between expectation and reality, would soon ripple through every camp and every diary. It was the beginning of a strange and paradoxical chapter in World War II, one where the defeated found dignity under the care of their conquerors. And yet, to understand how such an outcome was even possible, one must look deeper into the machinery behind it. The American war economy, the transport system that spanned oceans, and the moral decision that transformed enemies into men once again. When the first Liberty ships carrying German prisoners left Europe in early 1945, the war was still raging across the continent, but these voyages carried a different kind of cargo. Men who no longer fought, no longer believed, and barely understood what awaited them. For many, the crossing itself felt like a surreal inversion of the war. Once they had dreamt of invading America through conquest. Now they were entering it as captives. The journey across the Atlantic was long and tightly controlled. Each transport ship held thousands of prisoners in the holds, packed but not mistreated. They were given regular meals, medical checks, and guarded by American naval personnel under strict orders to uphold Geneva Convention standards. Even on the sea, discipline remained firm but fair. Guards often spoke of how quiet the German prisoners were, organized, obedient, sometimes even grateful just to be alive. By the time the ships reached ports like Norfolk, Virginia, New York, and New Orleans, America had already begun constructing an enormous network of prisoner-of-war camps. Over 400,000 German POWs would eventually be housed in the United States, spread across 500 camps in nearly every state. Some of the largest stood in Texas, Iowa, Georgia, and Arizona, far from coastal cities, chosen for both security and farmland access. Each camp followed the same design: rows of wooden barracks behind chain-link fencing, guard towers at each corner, administrative buildings, mess halls, and recreation areas. But the difference from Europe was immediate. In America, food was plentiful. The U.S. government allocated rations to POWs equal in caloric value to those of American soldiers, roughly 3,200 calories per day. Meals included bread, butter, meat, potatoes, coffee, milk, and even fruit. To soldiers who had survived on watery cabbage soup and moldy bread at the front, it felt almost impossible. Letters and diaries preserved from those camps reveal the disbelief that swept through the ranks of captured Germans. "We eat bacon, eggs, and fresh bread every morning," wrote one POW in Camp Hearn, Texas. "It feels wrong, as if the world has turned upside down." The irony was profound. Across the Atlantic, Germany itself was starving. Allied bombings had shattered the transportation network. Food supply lines were collapsing. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht ration scale had fallen below subsistence level. Soldiers often relied on requisition, or outright looting, from local civilians just to survive. In comparison, American POW camps became unintended sanctuaries of nutrition and order in a world otherwise disintegrating. Yet the generosity wasn't without purpose. Washington understood that humane treatment wasn't merely moral, it was strategic. Every German soldier treated well became a living testimony to the fairness of the Allied cause. It countered Nazi propaganda that painted the Allies as sadistic conquerors. It also encouraged surrender. Field reports show that as rumors of decent treatment spread, German soldiers were more likely to give up rather than fight to the death, especially as defeat became inevitable. The American military bureaucracy operated this vast system with astonishing efficiency. Each camp had a commandant, medical staff, chaplains, and even internal POW councils that handled discipline within the ranks. Religious services were allowed. Education programs taught English and civics. Some camps even screened anti-Nazi films, hoping to re-educate captured soldiers in democratic values. The contrast between conqueror and captive grew more symbolic with every passing week. Inside the camps, the prisoners gained weight, wrote letters home, and worked on farms. Outside, the war continued to consume Europe in flames, as one U.S. officer observed in 1945. "Our prisoners are healthier than the people they left behind." That paradox, the defeated living better under their enemy's guard than under their own flag, would soon raise questions both moral and political. Why did America invest so much humanity in its enemies, And what effect would this kindness have on those who once swore allegiance to Hitler's Reich? Those questions would reveal their answers not in policy memos, but in the daily lives of the men behind the wire, in their hunger, their labor, and the slow rediscovery of what it meant to be human. For the captured German soldier, the first weeks inside an American camp were a confrontation not with hatred, but with contradiction. These were men trained to believe that their enemies were ruthless, that capture meant degradation or death. Nazi propaganda films had drilled it into them. The Americans were brutal, decadent, racially impure. And yet, when they arrived in U.S. custody, the reality defied every expectation. The camps were clean, the guards professional, the rations abundant. There were no beatings, no deliberate starvation, no revenge parades. Instead, there was paperwork, medical inspection, and routine. The men were treated as soldiers, not criminals. This, perhaps more than any Allied victory, struck at the moral foundation of Hitler's war. Prisoners were given soap, new uniforms marked PW, and blankets. They were fed on schedule, permitted to write home, and allowed to gather in groups for religious service. Evenings brought music from harmonicas or handmade guitars. Some camps held soccer matches. Others organized theater plays. Within weeks, many German POWs began to feel a strange relief. They were, for the first time in years, safe. But safety carried its own burden. Some were tormented by guilt. How could they, the defeated, be eating full meals while their families in Germany starved? Letters from home told of bombed cities, hunger, and despair. One prisoner in a Texas camp wrote, "My mother writes that she eats once a day. I cannot eat my bread without shame." Inside the barbed wire, a quiet transformation was taking place. The men who had once marched under the swastika were now experiencing something they had been told did not exist: fairness without ideology. The simple act of being treated as a human being began to dissolve years of indoctrination. The American guards noticed it too. Though some were wary, veterans who had seen friends die in Normandy or Bastogne, they followed orders with professionalism. They were instructed to treat POWs with dignity. It was not compassion alone. It was policy, rooted in military discipline and America's self-image as a nation of law. Over time, trust took small, hesitant steps. Guards and prisoners learned each other's names. Some exchanged cigarettes. A few even posed together for photographs. For many German soldiers, this civility felt more shocking than any battlefield defeat. "I cannot understand," one sergeant wrote in his diary. "They are our enemies, yet they treat us like men." That sentence would echo across hundreds of similar testimonies. For the prisoners, captivity in America became an education not only in democracy but in decency, something their own regime had buried beneath fear and obedience. The mind of the prisoner was its own battlefield. For years, German soldiers had been immersed in a moral universe built on superiority and hatred. In Hitler's Reich, surrender was shame, compassion was weakness, and mercy was treason. Yet here, under an enemy's watch, those very traits defined survival. At first, many POWs clung to their ideology. They saluted each other in secret, whispered Hitler's name at night, and organized informal loyalist groups. But the environment around them, orderly, fair, and undeniably humane, began to erode the walls of belief. American officers noticed two types of prisoners emerging: the fanatics, who refused to admit defeat, and the realists, who saw the war for what it was, a tragedy engineered by arrogance. Over time, the realists grew in number. The more the Americans kept their word, the more the prisoners questioned everything they had been taught. Psychologists and intelligence officers took note. They saw how consistent decency weakened resistance far more effectively than brutality ever could. The U.S. Military Intelligence Service, MIS, even ran programs within the camps to identify anti-Nazi sentiment and promote re-education through discussion groups, reading sessions, and lectures on democracy. For the prisoners, these experiences were confusing, sometimes painful. They were being confronted not by force but by the quiet power of moral contrast. As one POW later recalled, "They defeated us not only with tanks but with kindness, and that was harder to endure." By the end of 1945, thousands of German prisoners were no longer thinking of escape or vengeance, but of understanding. The fences remained, but the fear had gone. In its place was a kind of uneasy respect, one that would linger long after the war ended. And as their lives in captivity took on rhythm and meaning, another transformation was unfolding, not of hearts alone, but of systems, the logistical, military, and moral framework that made all of this possible. The humane treatment of German prisoners in America wasn't an accident of kindness. It was a matter of command discipline and deliberate design. The U.S. Army had studied the mistakes of the First World War, when returning German POWs had fueled resentment by telling stories of mistreatment. This time, Washington wanted a different legacy. The directive from the War Department was clear. Every German soldier in U.S. custody would be treated in strict accordance with the Geneva Convention of 1929. That document required humane living conditions, equal rations to those of the captor's own troops, and respect for religious practice. To enforce this, the U.S. Army created a dedicated prisoner of war branch under the Provost Marshal General's office. Each camp was inspected, each report filed, and violations swiftly corrected. Even small details mattered. POWs could not be used for dangerous labor. They could not be denied medical treatment. They had to be addressed by rank and name, not by insult. These rules were not only moral but strategic. By maintaining standards, the U.S. ensured reciprocal treatment for captured American soldiers in Europe. Every loaf of bread given to a German in Texas, in theory, protected a captured airman in a German stalag. Still, within the ranks, there were quiet debates. Many guards had lost brothers and friends in the war. Some found it hard to serve hot meals to men who had once marched under the swastika, but discipline prevailed. "We fight like hell," General Dwight D. Eisenhower once remarked, "but we don't hate like hell." That principle guided the American approach in a cold, structured mercy that refused to descend into vengeance. Beyond morality, there was practicality. America's vast agricultural economy faced a labor shortage by 1944. Millions of young men were overseas fighting, and farms back home were desperate for hands. German POWs, by international law, could be employed for non-military labor, so long as they were paid a fair wage and not exposed to danger. The War Department saw opportunity in necessity. Thousands of prisoners were sent to rural communities to work in cotton fields, lumber mills, orchards, and factories. They were paid in canteen credits, small allowances redeemable within camp stores for toiletries, writing paper, or even tobacco. It was a remarkable system, the defeated enemy helping to sustain the American home front. Farmers, at first wary, were surprised by the results. The Germans worked hard. Many were polite, skilled, and disciplined, veterans of a military culture that prized efficiency. In towns across Texas, Kansas, and Alabama, relationships began to form between locals and prisoners. Some farmers would later write letters to the War Department, requesting the same men return next season, even after the war was over. The irony deepened. The enemy, once feared, had become a neighbor, a worker, a man who could share a joke across the fence. For the Germans, the experience was equally disorienting. They saw America not as the land of chaos described by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda, but as something profoundly stable, industrious, fair, and free. It was during those long summer days in the fields that many POWs began to question the cause for which they had fought. "We saw their freedom with our own eyes," recalled one former prisoner decades later, "and we realized what we had been denied at home." Despite its success, the policy was not without controversy. Back home, American citizens and soldiers' families sometimes complained, "Why feed the enemy steak while our boys eat K rations in the mud?" Newspapers printed letters accusing the government of misplaced mercy. But Washington stood firm, arguing that the moral high ground was part of victory itself. The Red Cross regularly inspected the camps, and reports confirmed that U.S. facilities met, and often exceeded, international standards. That transparency became a quiet weapon in the propaganda war. Leaflets dropped over German lines described humane treatment in Allied camps, encouraging surrender and undermining Nazi fear narratives. It worked. By 1945, surrender rates had risen dramatically. Many captured soldiers openly sought American units rather than Soviet or even British ones, knowing their odds of survival and dignity were higher under the stars and stripes. This wasn't accidental idealism. It was calculated humanity, a recognition that mercy could be more persuasive than any weapon. And within those carefully maintained boundaries of decency, America projected an image that would shape post-war diplomacy for decades. The irony was striking. While Germany's empire collapsed under the weight of brutality, the United States strengthened its own moral authority through restraint. And inside the fences of those quiet camps, thousands of German soldiers were beginning to see that truth firsthand. But the full impact of this policy, and the emotional turning point it created among the prisoners themselves, would come later, in a moment neither side expected, when the spirit of Christmas descended upon the barbed wire. It was December 1944, deep in the heart of Texas. The war in Europe still raged, but here, thousands of miles from the front, snow dusted the pine barracks of Camp Hearn. Rows of barbed wire glistened in the morning frost. Inside, hundreds of German prisoners gathered in quiet anticipation. For the first time in years, they were allowed to celebrate Christmas freely. The American guards watched as the prisoners built a small wooden nativity scene from scrap lumber and ration tins. They hung paper stars made from old cigarette packs and sang Stille Nacht. The sound drifted across the camp, carried by the winter wind, haunting, beautiful, and utterly human. Some guards stopped to listen. Others, moved by the moment, joined softly with their own voices. Two armies, enemies on the battlefield, were singing the same carol under the same sky. The Germans were astonished. They had expected mockery, perhaps punishment. Instead, the camp commandant permitted the celebration, even ordered that each prisoner receive an extra helping of food for Christmas Eve: roast beef, potatoes, butter, and pie. It was more than they had eaten in months. For men who had fought in the snow of the Ardennes and the ruins of Aachen, the experience was surreal. The very nation they had been told to hate was offering warmth, music, and food. The disbelief that had begun on the day of their capture was now transforming into quiet reflection. One prisoner later wrote, "It was the first Christmas I spent without fear, and it was my enemy who gave it to me." In the months that followed, diaries and letters from across dozens of camps echoed the same astonishment. At Camp Algona in Iowa, a German lieutenant noted that their rations included real milk and fresh bread every morning. In Camp Swift, Texas, prisoners played soccer matches with their guards. In Camp Clinton, Mississippi, they attended English lessons taught by local teachers. And in nearly every camp, there was a constant: the food was good, sometimes astonishingly good. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps ensured that POW rations were nearly identical to those given to American soldiers. There was meat 3 times a day, vegetables, and even desserts. The Geneva Convention required equal treatment, but America went beyond compliance. It made decency a logistical routine. Meanwhile, news from Europe told a different story. Letters smuggled through the Red Cross revealed that Germany's civilians were starving. Cities like Dresden and Hamburg were reduced to ash. Bread was rationed to a few ounces per day. For the prisoners, it was a tormenting irony. They lived better as captives than their families did in freedom. Many wrestled with guilt. Some sent their own rations back home: dried milk, soap, chocolate, to parents and wives who hadn't seen such things in years. Others began questioning not just the war, but the values that had led them into it. "We were told the Americans were barbarians," one corporal wrote. "But they feed us, clothe us, and let us sing our songs. Who then are the barbarians?" The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was deep. Psychologists studying the camps later described it as a moral inversion, the collapse of ideology through simple acts of fairness. The prisoners began forming libraries, studying English, and attending lectures on politics and philosophy. They debated democracy versus dictatorship, sometimes passionately, sometimes bitterly, but always within the strange peace of captivity. By mid-1945, that peace took on a new shape. In many camps, guards and prisoners developed mutual respect and even friendship. It was not sentimental. It was built on routine, reliability, and discipline. When a prisoner escaped, guards often noted that others helped track him down, fearing collective punishment or simply unwilling to betray the fragile order they had built. In some camps, local American families invited POW work details to join them for church on Sundays. Farmers who had once feared Nazi invaders now shook hands with polite young men who worked their fields. A few families even sent gifts to the camps: pies, books, or letters of kindness. To many Americans, it was an expression of their nation's principles, that even in war, decency was not weakness. To many Germans, it was the first tangible proof that such principles were real. Inside one camp, a Catholic chaplain ended his Christmas Mass with a single line that would later be repeated by POWs in their memoirs. "Today, you are not enemies. You are men in God's care." Those words, simple as they were, carried more power than propaganda ever could. For the men behind the wire, the realization was unmistakable. The Reich had promised glory and delivered ruin. The Americans promised nothing and gave them dignity. As 1945 unfolded and Germany began to collapse, that contrast grew sharper. And soon, the collapse of the Third Reich would reach the gates of every POW camp, bringing with it the news that would change their lives forever and force them to choose what kind of men they wished to be when they returned home. It was May 8, 1945. Across the Atlantic, church bells rang and newspapers screamed the headline, "Germany surrenders, the war in Europe is over." In America's prisoner of war camps, the news spread slowly, whispered first by guards, then confirmed by radio, and finally announced in roll call by officers who could barely believe the words themselves. The reaction was unlike anything the camps had ever seen. Some prisoners cheered, and not for victory but for relief. Others wept in silence, staring at the ground as though the earth itself had betrayed them. A few shouted that it was Allied propaganda and stormed away from the loudspeakers, fists clenched, faces pale. But deep down they knew. The Reich was gone. Hitler was dead. Everything they had fought for had turned to dust. That night, the camps were quieter than ever before. No singing, no soccer games, no laughter, only the creak of bunks and the occasional muffled sob. In some barracks, men tore insignias from their uniforms. In others, they burned them in tin cans, the smoke curling into the rafters like a funeral incense. "We were soldiers without a country," wrote one prisoner later. "We no longer knew who we were fighting for, or who we had been fighting against." In the weeks that followed, interrogations changed tone. American intelligence officers no longer asked about troop movements or supply chains. They asked about belief. "What did you think of the Führer? Did you know about the camps? Do you still believe in the Reich?" For some, these questions were unbearable. Propaganda had been their world. The idea of a 1,000-year empire was the only faith they had left. When that illusion collapsed, many fell into despair, not just psychological but existential. A few even took their own lives, unable to face the shame of defeat or the realization of what their nation had done. Others, however, began to see clearly for the first time. They listened to Allied broadcasts about concentration camps, saw photographs of emaciated prisoners, and read testimonies from survivors. At first, they called it lies. Then they saw the evidence. Film reels shown by American officers, the liberation footage of Buchenwald and Dachau. The faces, the bodies, the bulldozers. "We could not look away," one German POW wrote in his diary. "For years we thought we were the heroes. That day I realized we were the villains in someone else's story." That realization, quiet, shameful, but transformative, was the true end of the war for many. It marked the collapse of ideology and the birth of conscience. Not every prisoner broke down. Some began to rebuild, mentally and morally, inside the wire. They organized discussion groups about rebuilding Germany, wrote letters to American friends, and joined re-education programs offered by the U.S. Army. These programs didn't preach revenge or humiliation. They taught democracy, journalism, ethics, and critical thinking. The Americans understood something profound. If Germany were ever to rise again without repeating its past, the seeds of that rebirth had to be planted in captivity, among the very soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler. Many POWs later said those lessons changed them more than any battlefield ever could. "America conquered us with kindness," one former Luftwaffe pilot confessed years later. "They defeated us with food, fairness, and freedom. And in that defeat, I found the man I was supposed to be." By the end of 1945, the war was over, but the transformation continued. Camps once filled with suspicion and anger became small communities of learning. Some Germans even volunteered to teach younger prisoners how to read or write English. Bands formed. Plays were performed. Painters filled sketchbooks with portraits of guards who had become their friends. And for those who had lost everything, These small acts of normalcy were lifelines, fragile threads that tied them back to humanity. As repatriation began in 1946, trains carried thousands of German POWs back to Europe. They traveled with mixed emotions: gratitude, shame, and fear of what awaited them in the ruins of their homeland. In their hands were letters, small notebooks, and photographs, memories of a captivity that had somehow felt freer than their life under the Reich. Some wrote farewell notes to the guards who had treated them kindly. "You showed us what Germany forgot," one letter read. "When I plant my first crop again, I will remember the Americans who let me taste bread without hatred." Back in Germany, the reality was harsher than anyone imagined. Cities were flattened, families scattered, and the word Nazi had become a curse. But many of those returning POWs carried something that no bomb could destroy: a quiet conviction that decency was stronger than ideology. They became teachers, writers, engineers, and in some cases, critics of the regime they once served. Their memories of captivity became moral foundations for a new generation. "We came to America as soldiers," one veteran wrote decades later. "We left as men who understood freedom, not as a word, but as a way of living." The year was 1947. Winter again covered the American heartland in frost. But this time the camps were quieter, emptier. Rows of barracks stood still beneath the snow, their fences beginning to sag, their gates unguarded. The war was over. The prisoners were going home. But for thousands of German POWs, home was no longer a word that meant what it once did. Trains rattled east across the Atlantic ports, from New York to Boston, from Norfolk to New Orleans. At every departure station, American guards and German prisoners exchanged handshakes that just 2 years earlier would have been unthinkable. Some guards slipped ration chocolate or photographs into their hands. Others simply nodded in silence, knowing that these men were returning to a nation that no longer existed. On board the ships bound for Bremen and Hamburg, men stood along the rails, staring out at the Atlantic. The same ocean that had once separated them from their enemy, now the same path carrying them toward uncertainty. "I do not know what waits for us," one diary entry read, "but I will never forget the kindness of those who should have hated us most." When the ships reached Europe, silence followed. Harbors lay in ruins. The smell of diesel, salt, and smoke filled the air. Entire city skylines were gone. Nothing but twisted steel and blackened stone. As the POWs stepped ashore, many couldn't find their families. Others discovered that their homes had been reduced to rubble or occupied by strangers. The world they had left to fight for the Reich was dead. Food was scarce. The black market thrived. The proud Wehrmacht veterans, once hailed as saviors, returned as symbols of failure. Yet amid the devastation, something new was growing: a faint sense of humility, of rebuilding, of atonement. For many ex-prisoners, the contrast between captivity in America and the chaos of home was staggering. They had been fed, sheltered, and taught by their former enemies, and now in their own land, survival was harder than it had ever been. "It was in defeat," one ex-soldier recalled, "that I learned what victory should have meant." In the ruins of Nuremberg, Frankfurt, and Cologne, the lessons learned behind barbed wire began to shape a new generation. Some former POWs joined reconstruction efforts under the Allied occupation. Others became voices of reform, arguing that Germany must never again surrender its morality to ideology. In one remarkable case, former prisoners helped establish agricultural cooperatives modeled after the farms they had worked on in America. They introduced crop rotation techniques, humane labor practices, and shared ownership, small but revolutionary, acts that symbolized a rebirth grounded in decency. Historians later noted that the humane treatment of POWs had a psychological ripple effect that no propaganda could have achieved. It softened bitterness, prevented rebellion, and opened minds that might otherwise have closed forever. One American historian summarized it simply: the United States did not just win the war, it won the peace, one meal at a time. Years after the war, a quiet correspondence began between former captors and captives. German veterans wrote letters to American farmers who had hosted them as laborers. Some even returned to visit. Men who had once fought under the swastika now standing beside their former guards, smiling for photographs in the same fields they had once tilled in chains. These reunions were not dramatic. They were human. Two old men shaking hands under the same sun, bound not by politics, but by memory. One farmer's widow recalled a letter from a former POW. "You gave me back my dignity when my country had taken it. I will never forget that the first bread of peace I ever ate was given by an American hand." Such letters became testaments to a quiet redemption, not for the Reich, but for the individual soldier who discovered that mercy could outlast ideology. By the 1950s, most German POWs had returned home. They rarely spoke of their captivity publicly. To many, it was a private story, a bridge between guilt and gratitude. But historians who later studied their testimonies found a consistent pattern. They had entered the war as soldiers of Hitler and left it as witnesses of humanity. Their stories shaped post-war understanding of justice and reconciliation. They became living proof that compassion was not weakness, it was strength. And that feeding an enemy could do more to end a war than any bomb ever could. The war had crushed their pride, but captivity had restored their conscience. "They treated us not as monsters," one veteran said decades later, "but as men. That is what broke us and what healed us." And yet, as the years passed, one question remained. What were the long-term consequences of this unexpected mercy? What did this treatment mean for America, for Germany, and for the nature of war itself? That's the question history still asks today, and it leads us directly into the aftermath, the consequences, statistics, and historical reflection of what this moral victory truly achieved. When the war finally ended in 1945, the United States faced a logistical challenge unlike any in its history. Nearly 425,000 German prisoners of war were scattered across 511 camps in America, from the pine forests of Georgia to the wide plains of Kansas, from the deserts of Arizona to the snow-laden fields of Wisconsin. Each camp was a self-contained world. And now, that world had to be dismantled. The U.S. Army began the enormous process of repatriation, identifying, documenting, and shipping hundreds of thousands of prisoners back across the Atlantic. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment until release, and the Americans obeyed it to the letter. But what emerged from that process was more than compliance. It was a kind of moral accounting. For 4 years, the United States had housed the enemy, fed them, clothed them, and even paid them wages for labor. Many citizens had questioned the policy. Why should an enemy soldier live comfortably while American families rationed butter, sugar, and gasoline? Yet the War Department remained firm. How a nation treated its captives would define its civilization. That principle, born of both practicality and conscience, became one of the most successful humanitarian efforts of the war. The U.S. POW program operated with remarkable precision. Each camp maintained strict schedules, roll calls, meal times, work shifts, yet avoided brutality. The War Department insisted that discipline could exist without cruelty. Commanders were trained not as jailers, but as managers of men. Prisoners worked on farms, railroads, and factories, easing the wartime labor shortage. For every day of work, they earned small credits redeemable at camp stores. They bought cigarettes, soap, or sometimes books, simple comforts that reminded them of life beyond war. Inspections were regular and rigorous. Red Cross officials visited camps frequently, ensuring the Geneva Convention was respected. Reports from 1944 and 1945 show near universal compliance, with only isolated complaints, most about boredom or homesickness rather than mistreatment. In return, the prisoners maintained order. Escape attempts were rare, mutinies non-existent. Many guards later said that German discipline, drilled into them since youth, ironically made them ideal prisoners. They were soldiers to the end, one camp commander recalled. They kept their bunks straight, their boots polished, and their dignity intact, even behind barbed wire. One of the most remarkable outcomes of the American POW program was its quiet transformation of public perception. For years, wartime propaganda had portrayed the Germans as mechanical, heartless, and cruel. But when American townspeople encountered POWs working in their fields or helping rebuild barns, those images began to fade. Farmers discovered that many prisoners were barely older than their own sons. Some spoke English, some played music, some even prayed before meals. The distance between enemy and man began to shrink. Letters from local residents to camp officials often reflected this change. "We feared them at first," wrote one Iowa farmer, "but after they fixed our fence and shared coffee with us, I could not hate them anymore." That quiet reconciliation, repeated across hundreds of towns, became an unplanned experiment in empathy. Without speeches or treaties, two nations had begun to understand one another, not on the battlefield but across kitchen tables and plowed fields. By the end of 1946, nearly all German POWs had been repatriated. A few thousand volunteered to stay longer, helping harvest crops or rebuild communities. According to official records, less than 1% of German prisoners in American custody died during captivity, an astonishing statistic in the bloodiest war of human history. By contrast, mortality rates for Allied prisoners held by Germany or Japan were far higher, over 20% in the Pacific Theater alone. The comparison did not go unnoticed. Newspapers in Europe and neutral nations began to highlight America's treatment of POWs as evidence of moral authority, proof that democracy could remain humane, even in victory. The U.S. had not only defeated fascism with force, but discredited it through example. As one historian later wrote, "Where the Axis ruled with fear, the Allies ruled with law. Where Hitler built camps of death, America built camps of dignity." By late 1947, most camps stood empty. Barbed wire was taken down, watchtowers dismantled, and fields returned to the farmers. But the legacy of those places lingered, in diaries, in memories, and in the quiet letters that crossed the ocean for decades afterward. The war had ended in gunfire. But peace, it seemed, had been built in mess halls, labor fields, and classrooms where enemy soldiers learned not only English, but empathy. And yet, as these men returned home, another transformation began, one that would shape post-war Europe itself. When the last German prisoners boarded their ships home, America did not realize that it had planted one of the most powerful seeds of post-war reconstruction: trust. Those same men who had eaten from U.S. Army mess halls and labored in American fields would soon become the backbone of a reborn nation. They carried with them an unexpected image of their former enemy: fair, disciplined, and humane. In interviews conducted by German historians during the 1950s, many returning POWs described the same moment of revelation: that democracy was not chaos, and that liberty could coexist with order. They had seen it firsthand in the camps. The guards followed rules, not rage. The officers commanded with authority, not fear. For men who had grown up under authoritarian rule, this was a profound education. In America, one ex-prisoner said, "We learned that a soldier can obey without surrendering his soul." These realizations shaped a generation of veterans who would later work under the emerging democratic government of West Germany. They carried into politics, education, and civil life a quiet but powerful belief that dignity and discipline could exist together. When the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, was founded in 1949, its leadership included men who had once been POWs in Allied hands. Their experiences in captivity deeply influenced their political philosophy. They rejected the culture of blind obedience that had defined the Nazi era and instead embraced civic responsibility and self-criticism. Former prisoners became teachers, mayors, engineers, and writers. Some joined the newly formed Bundeswehr, Germany's post-war army, which was built around the principles of restraint and legality, in stark contrast to the militarism of the past. American officials noticed this shift. During the early years of the Cold War, U.S. policymakers often cited the humane POW treatment as one reason West Germany became a stable ally instead of a resentful, defeated power. The psychological reconstruction of the German soldier had begun behind barbed wire. It wasn't propaganda. It was lived experience. When the Marshall Plan was announced in 1948, offering massive economic aid to rebuild Europe, the U.S. found in Germany a surprisingly receptive partner. Part of that cooperation stemmed from memory. Many German officials remembered how American camps had functioned, efficiently, lawfully, even generously. It was easier to accept aid from a nation that had treated one's sons with humanity. Historians now argue that America's moral reputation after the war was as decisive as its military power. By showing mercy to the defeated, it established itself not just as a conqueror, but as a custodian of order and decency. This moral credibility helped stabilize Western Europe, attract global allies, and counter Soviet propaganda that painted the U.S. as imperialist. It also shaped future American military policy. The lessons learned from the POW camps influenced U.S. conduct in Korea and even Vietnam, though not always successfully repeated. The precedent had been set. Power must be tempered by principle. For the German prisoners themselves, the legacy was more intimate. Many kept diaries filled with reflections on those years, sketches of camp life, lists of English words learned, even recipes from American mess halls. Some returned to visit the towns where they had once been prisoners. Others named their children after American soldiers who had treated them kindly. These small, personal gestures echoed the larger truth, that war could end. But the memory of compassion could endure far longer than hatred. In the decades that followed, several former POWs became outspoken advocates for reconciliation. They joined veterans associations that promoted peace and cross-cultural dialogue. In 1983, a group of former German prisoners and American guards reunited at a former campsite in Texas. They shared stories, exchanged gifts, and stood for a moment of silence for all who had died, on both sides. "We were enemies," one old soldier said softly, "but they fed us like brothers. That is why I could never hate again." The physical war ended in 1945, but for many the moral war ended years later, when forgiveness replaced fury, and understanding took root where ideology once stood. The POW camps of America became unlikely classrooms of democracy, places where men stripped of their uniforms rediscovered their humanity. In time, historians would come to describe it not as a footnote of World War II, but as one of its quietest triumphs, because victory in the truest sense was not measured in tanks or territory, but in the ability to defeat hatred without becoming it. The guns of World War II fell silent more than 70 years ago, but some of its deepest lessons were not written in treaties or carved on memorials. They were served on tin trays, under floodlights in quiet camps half a world away from the front. In those places, men who had once shouted Sieg Heil found themselves humbled, hungry, and disarmed. And the hands that fed them belonged not to conquerors, but to ordinary American soldiers, boys from Kansas, Ohio, and Georgia, who obeyed the rules of war, even when the war had stopped obeying. Rules, that choice, to feed rather than humiliate, became one of the rare moral victories of the 20th century. It did not erase the crimes of the Reich, nor did it sanctify its soldiers, but it proved something larger, that civilization is tested not in moments of triumph, but in how it treats the defeated. Where hatred could have continued, restraint prevailed. Where vengeance could have been justified, compassion prevailed. Years later, as the former prisoners grew old, many spoke of those meals, that fairness, that strange kindness they had not expected from the enemy. They told their children that America had treated them better than the regime they had served. And in those quiet admissions lay the final irony of the war, that the army which conquered them also restored their faith in humanity. "We lost the war," one former German officer wrote. "But in those camps I learned what it meant to be human again." The legacy of that lesson still lingers, in every humanitarian code, every Geneva Convention, every decision to treat the enemy with dignity rather than destruction. Because once, in the aftermath of the bloodiest conflict in history, mercy had proved more powerful than any weapon. The story of the German POWs in America is not about defeat. It is about what remains when war strips everything else away, the thin line between cruelty and compassion, and the choice that defines not victory, but civilization itself.